The training world of Illyrian rotated slowly beneath a pale violet star, its artificial oceans glimmering like sheets of molten glass. From the high observation balcony of the command citadel, Queen Veysha watched the shifting landscape with mild impatience. Entire mountain ranges folded and unfolded as gravitational anchors recalibrated. Forests migrated in slow mechanical tides, and distant storms formed in perfectly calculated spirals. It was an extraordinary place, engineered to challenge even the most disciplined warriors. And yet, to her growing irritation, the exercises she had watched so far had been underwhelming. Her long ears twitched slightly as another group of human soldiers completed a maneuver on the far plain below. They moved cautiously, communicating constantly, pausing to analyze terrain before advancing. To Veysha, the display felt excessive. Her own warriors would have crossed the same ground in a fraction of the time, overwhelming any opposition through sheer momentum. "They seem to hold many discussions," she said at last, her voice calm but edged with dry amusement. General Theric, standing beside her, followed her gaze. "Humans believe in preparation, Your Majesty." Veysha allowed herself a faint smile. "Preparation is admirable. Excessive preparation is often another name for hesitation." Below them, one of the human soldiers tripped over a protruding section of artificial stone, stumbled, and nearly collided with another trooper. Even from the balcony, Veysha could see the embarrassed gestures and the laughter that followed. Tharic cleared his throat politely, but the queen did not bother hiding her amusement. "They laugh at their own mistakes," and she observed. "That is unusual." "It may help morale," Tharic suggested, "or it may indicate they expect many mistakes." The general wisely chose not to answer. The exercise concluded, and a new scenario began forming across the terrain. Massive plates shifted, raising jagged ridges and narrow canyons. Gravity fluctuated in subtle waves, making loose debris drift momentarily before settling again. The scenario briefing appeared on a hovering display. Mixed species adaptive combat simulation, unstable terrain conditions, limited visibility cycles. Veysha considered leaving. She had already seen enough to confirm her assumptions about human combat performance, but something about the changing terrain held her attention. The unstable gravity fields created unpredictable motion, and even her most experienced warriors found such environments challenging. She remained where she was, folding her arms behind her back. Below, soldiers assembled at their starting positions. Among the human contingent, one figure stood slightly apart, adjusting the straps of a field pack that looked unnecessarily heavy for his frame. He spoke to another soldier, and though the words did not reach the balcony, the other soldier laughed loudly enough that even Veysha could hear it echo faintly through the thin atmosphere. "What did he say?" she asked. Tharic consulted a translation feed. A faint expression of surprise crossed his face. "He told his companion that if he survives this exercise, he intends to file a formal complaint against gravity." For a moment, Veysha simply stared. Then, unexpectedly, a quiet breath of laughter escaped her. It was a soft sound, almost unfamiliar to her own ears. The simulation began. A low harmonic tone rolled across the terrain as gravity shifted without warning. Several soldiers staggered as their weight abruptly lessened, then returned. Dust rose in slow spirals. Visibility dropped as a dense silver mist began spreading through the valleys. At first, the engagement unfolded as Veysha expected. Larger, stronger fighters advanced confidently, securing elevated positions and driving opposing units back. The noise of weapons fire echoed in controlled bursts, flashes of energy lighting the fog in brief pulses. Then something unusual happened. The human soldier with the heavy pack disappeared. Veysha frowned slightly, scanning the field. It was not uncommon for individuals to be eliminated early in such chaotic scenarios, but there had been no elimination signal. The soldier had simply vanished. Minutes passed. The battle intensified. A group of armored warriors advanced through a narrow canyon, moving in tight formation. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted, tilting at a sharp angle. One warrior lost footing, colliding with another, and in the confusion, a series of small charges detonated. Not powerful enough to cause harm, but sufficient to disable equipment sensors. The entire unit was marked as neutralized. Veysha leaned forward slightly. "Who placed those charges?" she asked. Tharek adjusted the display. "Private Marcus Hale, Human Infantry." The name meant nothing to her, yet she continued watching. Marcus reappeared briefly on a ridge, moving quickly, almost casually, before vanishing again into the mist. He did not confront opponents directly. Instead, he seemed to guide them, subtly influencing their movements, steering them toward unstable ground or narrow passages where their size became a disadvantage. At one point, two towering warriors pursued him into a low tunnel carved by shifting rock. They entered confidently. Moments later, the tunnel ceiling lowered as gravity anchors recalibrated, forcing them to crouch awkwardly. Marcus, already anticipating the shift, slid through a side passage and tagged both targets before they could turn. Over the comm channel, faint but audible through the observation feed, his voice carried, "I really should start charging rent for all these traps I'm building." Several observers nearby exchanged puzzled looks. Veysha did not smile this time. She was too focused. There was nothing physically impressive about Marcus. He was smaller than many opponents, less heavily armored, lacking the raw power her warriors considered essential. And yet, piece by piece, he dismantled units that should have overwhelmed him. He was not fighting the enemy alone, she realized. He was fighting the battlefield itself, and winning. For the first time since arriving at Illyrian, Queen Veysha felt the faint, unfamiliar stirrings of genuine curiosity. The mist thickened across the shifting valleys of Illyrian, turning the battlefield into a pale, drifting labyrinth. From the observation balcony, Queen Veysha followed the movement of icons across the tactical display. But she found herself looking less at the abstract symbols and more at the real terrain below, where shadows moved in silence, and the ground itself refused to remain still. Marcus appeared again, briefly, sprinting along the edge of a fractured ridge. The gravity field shifted without warning, and the stones beneath his feet began to rise in slow floating fragments. Instead of stopping, he adjusted instantly, pushing off one drifting slab to land on another, moving as if he had expected the ground to betray him at any moment. "He anticipated that," Veysha murmured. Tharek nodded slowly. "It would seem so." On the battlefield, a squad of heavily armored warriors advanced through the mist, their visors glowing faintly as they scanned for movement. They were cautious now, no longer charging blindly. Word of the earlier eliminations had spread quickly. One of them raised a hand, signaling a halt. The group listened. The wind made a low, hollow sound as it passed through the canyon walls. Then faintly there was another noise, a rhythmic tapping. One warrior turned toward the sound, stepping forward carefully. The tapping continued, irregular, echoing strangely. He followed it around a narrow outcrop and immediately froze. A small device lay on the ground, striking a loose metal plate at regular intervals. A simple distraction. Behind them, Marcus emerged silently from the mist and tagged the rearmost soldier before anyone realized what was happening. By the time the others turned, he had already vanished again. Over the comm channel, his voice came through, calm and slightly amused. "You'd be surprised how often people investigate mysterious noises. It's practically universal." One of the eliminated warriors removed his helmet and shook his head, half laughing despite himself. "I knew it was a trap," he muttered. "I just didn't expect it to be that obvious." High above, Veysha felt the corners of her mouth twitch. The human was not merely effective, he was playful. That was not a quality she associated with combat. The exercise intensified as the simulation increased environmental instability. A low tremor passed through the terrain, and entire sections of ground began to tilt. In the distance, a gravity surge lifted a cluster of boulders into the air, where they drifted like silent satellites before slowly descending. Marcus moved through the chaos with an ease that seemed almost unnatural. He slid down inclines moments before they steepened, crossed unstable bridges just before they collapsed, and once even used a floating piece of debris to propel himself across a widening chasm. At one point, he misjudged a landing and nearly lost his balance, windmilling his arms for a moment before recovering. "Well," he said aloud, slightly breathless, "that was almost extremely embarrassing." The remark was picked up by the observation feed, and several officers on the balcony exchanged startled glances. Veysha did not look at them, but she heard the suppressed laughter behind her. Below, the number of active combatants continued to shrink. Larger fighters struggled as the terrain grew more unpredictable. Their strength, once an advantage, now made rapid adjustments difficult. Marcus, lighter and faster, adapted constantly, rarely staying in one place long enough to be surrounded. Eventually, only a handful of soldiers remained. The final confrontation unfolded in a region where gravity fluctuated in slow pulses, causing every movement to feel slightly delayed. Each step required careful timing. A towering warrior advanced toward Marcus, confident despite the unstable conditions. The difference in size between them was striking. For a moment, Marcus simply stood there, watching. Then he stepped backward, once, twice, leading the larger opponent forward. The warrior lunged. At that exact instant, the gravity field shifted. The ground beneath the warrior's leading foot lost weight, and his momentum carried him forward faster than he intended. Marcus sidestepped smoothly, placing a hand on the warrior's shoulder to guide the fall, and tagged him before he could recover. The entire exchange lasted less than 3 seconds. Silence settled over the observation balcony. Veysha exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the lone human standing in the drifting mist below. She felt something shifting within her. Not admiration, not yet, but a growing awareness that she was witnessing something she had not fully understood. Marcus looked around, realizing he was the last active participant. He removed his helmet, wiping condensation from his brow, and glanced up toward the distant balcony, though he could not possibly see who was watching. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "I suppose that went better than expected." He paused and then added thoughtfully, "I should still file that complaint about gravity." The battlefield slowly reset itself as the simulation ended. The mist thinned, gravity stabilized, and fractured terrain folded back into smooth plains as if nothing had happened. Automated drones descended in quiet formations, collecting markers and recalibrating sensors. Yet the silence that settled over the observation balcony felt heavier than the storm that had preceded it. Queen Veysha remained standing at the railing long after the final signal sounded. Below, soldiers were already gathering, some removing helmets, others laughing or gesturing animatedly as they replayed moments from the exercise. The human named Marcus stood among them, speaking casually with another soldier. His posture relaxed, as if dismantling superior opponents in a volatile gravity field were an ordinary afternoon activity. "That is him," Tharek said quietly, though it was unnecessary. "I know," Veysha replied. Her long ears shifted slightly, an unconscious sign of thoughtfulness among her people. She studied Marcus carefully, observing the easy way he moved, the absence of arrogance in his manner, the fact that he seemed more amused than triumphant. "That one does not behave like a victor," she said. "Perhaps humans celebrate differently." "Or perhaps," Veysha said slowly, "he does not measure victory in the same way." Below, Marcus bent to pick up a piece of equipment and nearly collided with a passing drone that hovered at shoulder height. He stepped back quickly, raising both hands. "Sorry," he said to the machine. "Didn't mean to invade your personal space." The drone emitted a soft mechanical chirp and drifted away. For a moment, Veysha was not certain whether she had witnessed a joke or a genuine apology. Either way, she found herself suppressing a smile again. Later in the debriefing chamber, the atmosphere was markedly different from the usual formal tone of such meetings. Holographic projections replayed segments of the exercise, highlighting tactical decisions and environmental shifts. Officers discussed movement patterns, reaction times, and structural vulnerabilities in the terrain algorithms. Marcus sat near the far end of the chamber, listening rather than speaking, occasionally rubbing the back of his neck as if slightly uncomfortable with the attention. At one point, an instructor paused the projection at the moment Marcus had lured 3 opponents into an unstable corridor. "Private Hale," the instructor said, "what led you to choose that position?" Marcus hesitated, glancing around as though wondering if the question had been meant for someone else. "Well," he said at last, "they were bigger than me, faster than me, and better armored. So I figured the best strategy was to avoid fighting them under conditions where those things mattered." A few quiet murmurs moved through the room. "And the trap?" the instructor pressed. Marcus shrugged slightly. "I wouldn't call it a trap. More like encouraging them to make a mistake they were already inclined to make." One of the officers raised an eyebrow. "And how did you know they would pursue you into that corridor?" Marcus gave a small, crooked smile. Because I would have. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the chamber. At the rear of the room, Queen Veysha listened without announcing her presence. She stood partially in shadow, observing the discussion, studying the way Marcus spoke, not with the rigid precision of a formal strategist, but with the calm clarity of someone who understood instinctively what others needed charts to explain. She began to see the pattern. Marcus did not overpower his opponents. He studied them. He allowed their assumptions to guide them into positions of weakness. He used their confidence as a lever, their strength as a weight that pulled them off balance. It was not merely skill, it was perspective. After the debriefing concluded, the soldiers began to file out. Marcus lingered near the projection table, staring at a paused image of the battlefield, as if still replaying the exercise in his mind. Veysha stepped forward. He noticed her immediately and straightened, clearly uncertain whether to salute, bow, or simply stand still. He settled on standing very still. "Private Marcus Hale," she said calmly. "Yes, Your Majesty." "I observed your performance today." Marcus nodded once. "I hope it met expectations." Veysha regarded him for a moment. "It exceeded them." He blinked, as if unsure how to respond to that. "I would ask you a question," she continued. "Why did you not engage your opponents directly when you had opportunities to do so?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Because," he said slowly, "if someone is stronger than you, fighting them on their terms is usually a bad idea. And yet you fought them." "Yes," Marcus said, a faint smile appearing, "just not on their terms." For the first time in many years, Queen Veysha felt the quiet, unmistakable sensation of learning something new. Not from a general, not from a scholar, but from a single human soldier who had spent an afternoon arguing with gravity and winning. The training cycles on Illyrian continued over the following days, each scenario growing more complex than the last. Artificial storms rolled across the simulation zones, gravity wells appeared without warning, and entire sections of terrain dissolved into shifting metallic sands that swallowed heavy armor like water. The exercises were designed to test limits, but for Queen Veysha they had begun to serve another purpose: observation. She attended more sessions than her advisors expected, often standing in silence while units deployed below. At first, the officers assumed she was evaluating the readiness of her own forces. Only Theric noticed that her attention was not divided among the battlefield. It was almost always fixed on one particular human. Marcus did not dominate every exercise. Sometimes he was eliminated early when conditions turned against him. Sometimes a mistake or a moment of bad timing forced him out of the scenario before it reached its midpoint. But even then, Veysha noticed, he watched the remainder of the simulation with intense concentration, studying the patterns of movement, the terrain shifts, the mistakes others made. And afterward, he laughed about his own failures more easily than anyone else. During one exercise, a sudden gravity inversion had sent an entire squad drifting helplessly upward until emergency stabilizers reasserted control. Marcus had been among them, spinning slowly in midair, arms folded as if reclining in an invisible chair. "Well," he had remarked over the comm channel, "at least the view is nice." One of Veysha's warriors, equally suspended, had responded dryly, "If this is your idea of leisure, I begin to understand your species better." Marcus had considered that. To be fair, this is still less stressful than paperwork. Even the simulation overseers had struggled to suppress laughter at that. Veysha began to understand something subtle but important. Marcus did not merely endure chaos, he was comfortable in it. Where others sought control, he sought opportunity. Where others reacted, he anticipated. One afternoon, she ordered a modified scenario, one not listed in the standard training rotations. The terrain generators created a labyrinth of narrow corridors, shifting walls, and variable lighting conditions. Visibility dropped to near zero in some sections, while others were illuminated by harsh, flickering light. The gravity remained stable, but the architecture itself moved unpredictably, corridors sealing and reopening at irregular intervals. This time, Veysha observed from within the control chamber itself, standing beside the engineers who monitored the simulation grid. Marcus entered the labyrinth along with several of her elite warriors. For a time, nothing happened. Movement was cautious, deliberate. The confined environment eliminated many of Marcus's usual advantages. There were fewer open spaces, fewer environmental hazards to exploit. Tharek folded his arms. This may prove difficult for him. Veysha said nothing. Minutes passed. Then one of the warriors reported movement in a side corridor. Another reported hearing footsteps in a different direction. The units began to converge, attempting to trap Marcus between them. On the overhead display, his signal moved slowly, almost lazily, through the corridors. Then the lights went out. For several seconds, the entire labyrinth fell into darkness. "What happened?" one of the engineers asked. Veysha raised an eyebrow. Moments later, emergency lighting activated, but only in certain sections. Other corridors remained dark, their sensors apparently disabled. On the comm channel, Marcus's voice came through, slightly distorted. "I may have accidentally found the maintenance panel." A pause. "Well," he added, "mostly accidentally." The warriors moved more cautiously now, uncertain of what lay in the darkness ahead. In confined spaces, sound carried strangely. Footsteps echoed, misleading the ear. A dropped piece of equipment clattered somewhere far away, drawing attention in the wrong direction. One by one, the warriors were tagged and eliminated, not through ambushes of speed or strength, but through confusion, misdirection, and timing. At one point, a warrior turned a corner and found Marcus sitting calmly on a low support beam, waiting. "I had a feeling you'd come this way," Marcus said. "How?" Marcus shrugged. "It's the only corridor that doesn't look suspicious." There was a brief silence before the warrior laughed despite himself and accepted the elimination tag. In the control chamber, Veysha watched the final moments as Marcus emerged from the labyrinth, slightly dusty, carrying a small portable power cell he had apparently removed from the lighting system. "You disabled half the grid with that?" one of the engineers asked later, incredulous. Marcus held up the power cell. "To be fair, it was already labeled "Do Not Remove." That usually means it's important." Even Tharek allowed himself a quiet chuckle at that. But Veysha did not laugh. Not because she was displeased, but because her thoughts had moved beyond amusement. She was beginning to understand that what she had once called weakness was something else entirely. Humans did not seek to overpower the universe. They adapted to it. They bent with pressure rather than resisting it. They survived by changing, by learning, by turning every flaw into a tool. And in that moment, watching Marcus stand in the quiet aftermath of the exercise, Queen Veysha realized that she had been measuring strength incorrectly all her life. The days that followed carried a different atmosphere across Illyrian. The training exercises continued, but word of the labyrinth scenario had spread through both human and non-human ranks. Soldiers who had once dismissed Marcus as merely clever now watched him with careful attention, trying to anticipate movements that seemed to come from nowhere. Marcus, for his part, seemed largely unaware of the attention. He spent long hours in the observation halls reviewing terrain maps and simulation recordings, often seated cross-legged on the floor with a data pad balanced on his knee, surrounded by half-empty cups of synth coffee that grew cold long before he remembered to drink them. One evening, while he was studying a recording of shifting gravity currents, a shadow fell across the projection. He looked up and immediately scrambled to his feet. Queen Veysha stood a short distance away, her posture relaxed, her long ears angled slightly forward, in what among her people signified attentive curiosity rather than authority. The chamber was nearly empty, the distant hum of machinery echoing faintly through the metal walls. "At ease," she said calmly. Marcus hesitated, then relaxed, though not completely. "Your Majesty." "I hope I am not interrupting." "No, ma'am, I was just trying to understand why I nearly broke my ankle in Sector 12 this morning." Veysha glanced at the projection. The recording showed Marcus stepping onto what appeared to be solid ground, only for the surface to soften unexpectedly into granular alloy sand, causing him to stumble and fall. "You recovered quickly," she observed. Marcus gave a faint smile. "Mostly because falling down repeatedly builds character." There was a brief silence. Then unexpectedly, Veysha said, "In my culture, falling down repeatedly builds embarrassment." Marcus blinked, surprised, then laughed quietly. The sound echoed softly in the chamber. easing the formality between them. I have been observing your methods, Veysha continued. You do not fight as others do. I try not to, Marcus replied. It usually works out better for everyone. For everyone? Well, he said thoughtfully. For me at least. Veysha studied him for a moment. You understand that many of my warriors are stronger than you. Yes, ma'am. And faster. Yes, ma'am. And more heavily armored. Marcus nodded. Yes, ma'am. I try not to think about that too much while they're chasing me. Veysha's lips curved slightly. And yet you defeat them. Marcus considered this carefully before answering. I don't defeat them because I'm stronger. I defeat them because I don't need to be. She tilted her head slightly. Explain. Marcus gestured toward the projection. Most species evolve around certain advantages. Strength, speed, natural weapons. Humans didn't really get any of those. So we adapted in other ways. We observe patterns, we improvise, we make tools, then we make tools to improve those tools. Eventually, solving problems becomes instinct. And you believe this makes humans dangerous? Marcus shrugged. I think it makes us persistent. Dangerous is usually just persistence plus opportunity. Veysha let the words settle in silence. After a moment, she said, Walk with me. They left the observation chamber and moved through a long corridor that overlooked the outer surface of Illyrian. Beyond the transparent alloy panels, the artificial horizon curved gently, dotted with distant training zones and drifting maintenance platforms. Farther still, the pale violet star burned steadily, casting soft light across the structure. Tell me something, Veysha said as they walked. During the labyrinth exercise, when you disabled the lighting grid, did you plan that in advance? Marcus shook his head. Not exactly. I just noticed the maintenance panel was poorly shielded. And you knew removing the power cell would create darkness in specific corridors. I guessed, Marcus admitted. I wasn't sure which sections would go dark. I just knew something interesting would happen. Veysha stopped walking. You acted without certainty. Yes, ma'am. Is that not risky? Marcus thought for a moment. Everything is risky. The trick is choosing risks where the outcome is unpredictable for everyone, not just for you. For a long moment, Veysha said nothing. The quiet hum of the station filled the silence. Then she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. I have spent much of my life believing that strength was a fixed quality, something measurable, something visible. Marcus looked out at the distant training fields. Maybe strength is just the ability to keep going when things stop making sense. Veysha regarded him thoughtfully. You speak like a philosopher. Marcus smiled faintly. No, ma'am. Philosophers usually get more sleep. She laughed then, a clear, unguarded sound that echoed faintly down the corridor. It was not the laughter of a queen addressing her court. It was simply the laughter of someone who had heard something honest and unexpected. As they resumed walking, Veysha realized something quietly profound. She was no longer studying Marcus as an example of human capability. She was speaking with him as an equal in thought, if not in rank. And for the first time, she began to consider that the alliance between their peoples might not be built on treaties or power balances, but on understanding. Training changed after that conversation, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in small ways that only the observant noticed. Scenarios became less predictable. Objectives were no longer announced in full. Some exercises ended without warning, while others continued long after participants believed they were finished. The instructors began introducing problems that had no obvious solution at all. And for the first time, Queen Veysha herself attended the planning briefings. At first, her generals were uneasy. Her presence changed the tone of every room. Even the most experienced officers chose their words carefully. But Veysha did not interfere with their procedures. She asked questions instead, quiet, precise questions about assumptions, about alternative outcomes, about what might happen if a plan failed at its most critical point. More than once, those questions forced entire strategies to be reconsidered. Marcus noticed the changes as well. One morning, he arrived at a training field to find a group of elite warriors studying a terrain map in visible frustration. What's the objective? He asked one of them. That, the warrior replied, pointing to the map, is precisely the problem. There isn't one. Marcus studied the projection. A vast region of unstable ground, scattered cover, fluctuating electromagnetic interference, but no marked targets, no defined victory conditions. So, Marcus said slowly, the objective is to figure out what the objective is. The warrior stared at him. That makes no sense. Marcus shrugged. It usually doesn't, at first. The exercise began, and confusion reigned for nearly an hour. Units moved cautiously, uncertain what they were meant to accomplish. Some attempted to secure territory, others searched for hidden markers, and a few simply waited, convinced the instructions had been incomplete. Marcus spent most of the time observing. Finally, he began placing small signal beacons at strategic points, creating a network of reference positions. I don't defeat them because I'm stronger. I defeat them because I don't need to be. She tilted her head slightly. Explain. Marcus gestured toward the projection. Most species evolve around certain advantages. Strength, speed, natural weapons. Humans didn't really get any of those, so we adapted in other ways. We observe patterns, we improvise, we make tools, then we make tools to improve those tools. Eventually, solving problems becomes instinct. And you believe this makes humans dangerous? Marcus shrugged. I think it makes us persistent. Dangerous is usually just persistence plus opportunity. Veysha let the words settle in silence. After a moment, she said, "Walk with me." They left the observation chamber and moved through a long corridor that overlooked the outer surface of Illyrian. Beyond the transparent alloy panels, the artificial horizon curved gently, dotted with distant training zones and drifting maintenance platforms. Farther still, the pale violet star burned steadily, casting soft light across the structure. "Tell me something," Veysha said as they walked. "During the labyrinth exercise, when you disabled the lighting grid, did you plan that in advance?" Marcus shook his head. "Not exactly. I just noticed the maintenance panel was poorly shielded. And you knew removing the power cell would create darkness in specific corridors." "I guessed," Marcus admitted. "I wasn't sure which sections would go dark. I just knew something interesting would happen." Veysha stopped walking. "You acted without certainty." "Yes, ma'am. Is that not risky?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Everything is risky. The trick is choosing risks where the outcome is unpredictable for everyone, not just for you." For a long moment, Veysha said nothing. The quiet hum of the station filled the silence. Then she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I have spent much of my life believing that strength was a fixed quality, something measurable, something visible." Marcus looked out at the distant training fields. "Maybe strength is just the ability to keep going when things stop making sense." Veysha regarded him thoughtfully. "You speak like a philosopher." Marcus smiled faintly. "No, ma'am. Philosophers usually get more sleep." She laughed then, a clear, unguarded sound that echoed faintly down the corridor. It was not the laughter of a queen addressing her court. It was simply the laughter of someone who had heard something honest and unexpected. As they resumed walking, Veysha realized something quietly profound. She was no longer studying Marcus as an example of human capability. She was speaking with him as an equal in thought, if not in rank. And for the first time, she began to consider that the alliance between their peoples might not be built on treaties or power balances, but on understanding. Training changed after that conversation. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in small ways that only the observant noticed. Scenarios became less predictable. Objectives were no longer announced in full. Some exercises ended without warning, while others continued long after participants believed they were finished. The instructors began introducing problems that had no obvious solution at all. And for the first time, Queen Veysha herself attended the planning briefings. At first, her generals were uneasy. Her presence changed the tone of every room. Even the most experienced officers chose their words carefully. But Veysha did not interfere with their procedures. She asked questions instead, quiet, precise questions about assumptions, about alternative outcomes, about what might happen if a plan failed at its most critical point. More than once, those questions forced entire strategies to be reconsidered. Marcus noticed the changes as well. One morning, he arrived at a training field to find a group of elite warriors studying a terrain map in visible frustration. "What's the objective?" he asked one of them. That, the warrior replied, pointing to the map, is precisely the problem. There isn't one. Marcus studied the projection. A vast region of unstable ground, scattered cover, fluctuating electromagnetic interference. But no marked targets, no defined victory conditions. So, Marcus said slowly, the objective is to figure out what the objective is. The warrior stared at him. That makes no sense. Marcus shrugged. It usually doesn't at first. The exercise began, and confusion reigned for nearly an hour. Units moved cautiously, uncertain what they were meant to accomplish. Some attempted to secure territory, others searched for hidden markers, and a few simply waited, convinced the instructions had been incomplete. Marcus spent most of the time observing. Finally, he began placing small signal beacons at strategic points, creating a network of reference positions. Your Majesty, are you certain about this? Veysha met his gaze evenly. If I am to understand what you have taught, I must experience it. Marcus nodded once. Fair enough. But if gravity tries to throw you into a wall, I'm not filing the complaint for you. I would not expect you to, she replied, and there was the faintest hint of amusement in her voice. The simulation began. Immediately, chaos unfolded. The terrain fractured into uneven platforms, suspended above a glowing atmospheric sea. Wind currents howled unpredictably, pushing combatants off balance. Distant structures collapsed and reassembled, corridors forming and dissolving in seconds. For a time, Veysha fought as she always had, decisively, powerfully, relying on her strength and speed. It worked at first. She eliminated several opponents with precise efficiency. Then the environment shifted. A sudden gravity surge sent debris spiraling upward. Visibility dropped as a dense electrical storm rolled across the platforms, distorting sensors and scattering units. Communication channels filled with static. Veysha found herself alone. For a moment, instinct urged her to advance aggressively, to force contact with the nearest signal. Then she hesitated. She remembered Marcus's voice. Do not fight them on their terms. Instead of charging forward, she slowed. She observed. The storm patterns were irregular, but not random. The platforms shifted in cycles. The wind currents followed subtle thermal gradients rising from the atmospheric sea below. She began to move differently, less directly, more patiently, using the environment rather than resisting it. She allowed stronger opponents to commit to attacks before repositioning, guiding them toward unstable ground or into the path of shifting debris. At one point, she deliberately retreated across a narrow bridge that she knew would collapse within seconds. Her pursuer followed, confident in superior strength. The bridge dissolved beneath them. Veysha had already leapt to a stable platform. Her pursuer, heavier and slower to adjust, fell into the storm below and was eliminated. She stood still for a moment, realizing what she had just done. She had not overpowered her opponent. She had outthought him. A quiet sense of clarity settled over her, not triumph, but understanding. Hours seemed to pass, though the simulation clock recorded only 40 minutes. One by one, participants were eliminated until only 2 signals remained active. Marcus and Veysha. They found each other on a broad platform overlooking the shifting storm. For a moment, neither moved. Well, Marcus said at last, lowering his training weapon slightly, this is awkward. Veysha tilted her head. Why? Because I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to fight you or congratulate you. She considered that. Perhaps both. They circled cautiously, each studying the other. Marcus moved first, feigning toward a narrow passage. Veysha did not follow. Instead, she waited, watching the pattern of the shifting floor. A second later, the passage collapsed exactly where Marcus had expected her to step. He stopped, looking back at her with a faint grin. You're learning. Yes, she said calmly. I am. They engaged briefly, not with full force, but with measured precision, testing each other's timing and perception. Neither gained a decisive advantage. At last, the platform beneath them began to destabilize, warning lights flashing as the simulation reached its time limit. Marcus stepped back, lowering his weapon completely. I think that's a draw. Veysha looked at the storm below, then back at him. No, she said quietly. It is a victory. For who? For understanding. The simulation ended, Later, as the artificial horizon of Illyrian glowed in the light of the violet star, Veysha stood once more on the observation balcony. The training fields were quiet now, the shifting terrain at rest. Marcus joined her after a while, leaning on the railing beside her. "You fought differently today," he said. "Yes. And?" Veysha looked out at the silent expanse. "I once believed strength meant dominating every opponent. Now I understand that true strength is the ability to change." Marcus nodded. "That's a useful lesson." They stood in silence for a while, watching maintenance drones drift like distant fireflies over the plains. At length, Veysha spoke again. "Our peoples will work together more closely now, not because treaties demand it, but because we have something to learn from one another." Marcus smiled faintly. "That sounds like a good reason." As the star dipped toward the artificial horizon, Queen Veysha felt a quiet certainty settle within her. The universe was vast, unpredictable, and often dangerous, but it was also filled with minds capable of growth, of adaptation, of seeing beyond the limits of their own assumptions. And she realized that the greatest victories were not the ones won in battle, but the ones won within oneself when an old belief gave way to a new understanding.